This embarrassingly long video is a critique of what I think was a Darwin Day presentation given by Sabur Ahmed, a Muslim creationist speaking at Coventry College, UK, earlier this year. He is not, so far as I can tell, a blatantly dishonest, willfully ignorant charlatan and conman such as I am used to in the States. But he is at the very least confused about this topic and has obviously been misled his entire life. I warned him that he would embarrass himself talking about this to college students, especially in the UK, and he invited me to post this critique explaining how he has done that. I quote him sometimes out of order, but only because he bounces around a bit and I want to keep related points together. I won't bother to correct everything he says. Who has the time? I'll just hit the key points that demonstrate why the rest of it is wrong.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah, amma ba'd. I'm going to start as Muslims do, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. So, what I'm going to be speaking about today is Darwinian evolution a fact? Like with most things in life, you have to define what you mean. So if you mean by fact, it is certain, it is absolute, it's not going to change, it's the same as if the earth is going around the sun, then Darwinian evolution defined that way is absolutely not a fact. If you define it a fact as something which is generally agreed upon in science, or it's the best theory available for the data that we currently have, then there's nothing really wrong with calling it a scientific fact from that perspective.
They're both the same thing. When we're talking about facts, we're talking about data that is verifiably accurate, or at least what can be confirmed. Evolution is the only theory we have explaining the data that we have, but it does change. It changes all the time because our understanding keeps improving. Science is like that. And scientists don't talk in terms of absolute conviction, a potentially philosophical sense that many religious people use. Although it would be perverse at this point to say that life does not evolve, that our species is not biologically related to other animals, or that all the taxonomic classifications are a fantastically improbable accident of coincidence. That would be a statistical impossibility, which reaches into the realm of reality denial. Still, if you had stopped there, I might have agreed with you, but you gave an example clarifying what you meant by absolute certainty, being how sure we are that the earth goes around the sun, as opposed to the other way around, I guess. If that's what you're calling absolute certainty, then yes, by that measure, evolution is an absolute fact to equal degree, because we know that just as certainly.
Now, what does that actually mean? Does that actually mean we can't have any knowledge? We can't be certain of anything? Of course not. We use induction every single day. All it means is we need to be humble with our conclusions.
Right, and that's why scientists don't use terms like absolute certainty, because there's never a need to. Science is not a belief system, it's an investigation where accuracy and accountability are paramount and where sensationalism is strongly discouraged. So whatever you say, you'd better be able to back it up. It is dishonest to assert as fact that which is not evidently true. So right away you can see where science differs from religion, which is not remotely humble about its conclusions. But in science, you can't even say that something is possible or probable unless we have some precedent or parallel, or at the very least an example of verified instance indicating that such possibility or probability exists.
And as I'm going to be showing today, firstly, science is revisable, meaning its conclusions can change. Darwinism is not an exception. If you're going to argue Darwinian mechanism or Darwinian evolution is an absolute fact, then it's no longer scientific, it's actually pseudoscience.
Already you're contradicting yourself. Is the Earth going around the sun an absolute fact, or is the heliocentric model of our solar system only pseudoscience?
It's really sad when we are told something is a fact, and the very first thing that we should do is understand a fact in science is not the same thing as fact in our common language.
Wrong. In every application that I'm aware of, a fact is a point of data which is either not in dispute, such as in hypothetical situations, or is indisputable in that it is objectively verifiable. Now, that is the definition I use when I say that evolution is a fact, and I'll explain why in a bit.
Every single scientific theory 50 years ago in chemistry, biology, physics is very different to what we have today. and extremely different to what we had 100 years ago.
Yes, but 100 years ago, we already had the theories of evolution and gravity, atomic theory, cell theory, and the germ theory of disease. All these fields have improved enormously since then, but they're still focused on the fact of evolution, gravity, atoms, cells, and germs. All these things are demonstrably factual 100 years later, and they still will be 100 years from now. At some point in your talk, you said that they once called phlogiston a scientific fact. No, they didn't. But the guy who disproved it replaced it with his theory of oxygen. How could you revise, or rather, the way you put it, refute the theory of oxygen?
And also that science is revisable. So all of its conclusions are provisional.
Understand that all science is revisable. That doesn't mean that conclusions change. It means that it can be revised. Revised means it can be amended or altered, which happens all the time in every field of study. But you're not talking about revision. You're hoping that evolution is refutable, and it's just not anymore, as I'll explain in a moment.
Every single scientific theory has to be, in principle, falsifiable. Now, what does that mean? That means you should be able to conceive of some evidence that will go against it. Now, a very simple way to put it is the way Einstein put it. No amount of experimental results can ever prove my theory right. One can prove it wrong. So science doesn't technically prove, it disproves.
I'm glad you said technically, because that is technically correct, but not entirely. While positive proof is generally reserved for mathematics, we can still employ proof in the legal sense, being an overwhelming preponderance of evidence establishing a fact or the truth of an argument. Einstein's theories have been proved repeatedly. His theory of how gravity bends space-time meant that it would also curve light twice as far as Newton said it should. Observations made during a solar eclipse in 1919 proved that he was correct. And his theory was proved again just a couple of months ago when they discovered the gravity waves that he predicted. And Darwin's theory has also been proved in similar fashion, again and again and again, by different predictions being made by the theory, being confirmed by various related fields of study. And I can go into detail if you like, but I'd just be repeating what I've said in several other videos. We can say the same thing about atomic theory, too. It's not like you don't have to worry about nuclear weapons because atoms are just a theory. So you've got two problems here, and not just that evolution is as certainly factual as atomic theory, cell theory, or the germ theory of disease, and is even better supported than the theory of gravity. Newtonian gravity was replaced by Einstein's relativity, but it just kept going. And that leads to the second problem, which is even bigger. How could anyone prove at this point that evolution, gravity, atoms, cells, or germs aren't even real? Because that's not what revisable means, but that's what you mean when you say it. And while that may be theoretically possible, you must understand that it is no longer realistically possible. All these things are facts, and the theories are there to explain them. But as I just showed you, the theories are factual too. You kept talking about the Darwinian mechanism as if there was only one, as if it was the same thing as the theory. And you repeatedly confuse theories with hypotheses. So try to understand that a theory is a body of knowledge which includes facts, falsifiable hypotheses, and their own sets of natural laws. Evolution has its own laws, just like other theories do.
So imagine you're in a lecture theatre like we are in right now, and you're listening to a lecturer, and the lecturer speaks about the fossil record, he speaks about genetics, he speaks about DNA, he speaks about all these different topics, and he says the Darwinian mechanism is absolute truth, whoever denies it is an idiot, and he just goes on a rant about how Darwin was so successful. And you actually say, well, I can accept it as a working model, but I think Darwinism is actually very speculative. I think it's based on a lot of assumptions, and I think there's actually disputes on the data that we actually have. And even the history of Darwinism, we had something known as the eclipse of Darwinism, between Darwin's death and what's known as the modern synthesis. A lot of biologists were ignoring natural selection as the main driving force of evolution. And you basically emphasize these three terms, and I think these three terms are what I want to stick to today, and it makes a nice acronym as well, SAD. Speculation, assumptions, and disputes. Now, what do you think his reaction's going to be if you actually, at the end of a 3-hour lecture, when he goes over all this evidence for Darwinism, you turn around and you say, actually, it's very speculative, it's based on assumptions and there's a lot of disputes on the data. You might hear something like, how dare you?
Or they might call your bluff and challenge you to prove it and prove that it means anything. It takes speculation just to conceive hypotheses, but then the hypotheses must be testable, which negates the speculation. And there are also commonly some dispute over the trivialities of how it happened, but not as to whether it happened at all, as if there's still some chance that it's not even real. Sorry, we're past all that now. And the reason we are is because it's not based on assumptions. It's based on predicted discoveries and testable evidence acquired over the last 150 years. It's based on demonstrable accuracy.
You have a picture here of Lynn Sagan. She tried to publish her endosymbiotic theory in the 1960s. She had to go through more than 10 peer-reviewed journals, and they all refused her. They refused to publish her work. And now her theory is taught in every single university in the world, including Coventry University. Right? She's an atheist. She's a biologist. She doesn't believe in neo-Darwinism. She calls it a religion, right?
Wrong. Lynn Margulis was referring to those who would not accept that there were more mechanisms of evolution than just natural selection. She argued that natural selection was not the primary mechanism. She never argued that it didn't exist or that it isn't a thing, and even your own citations refute you. She demonstrated a different mechanism related to evolution, but that doesn't negate that natural selection has already been proven to be real too. It's just a matter of specific aspects. Regarding multicellular eukaryotes, her theory doesn't explain population genetics, which conversely does not explain endosymbiosis.
So what Ford basically concludes is the history of life cannot properly be represented as a tree. And together along with him, another atheist biologist, very well known for developing the field, is the biologist Carl Woese. We have the 3 domains of the tree of life, and he actually discovered the 3rd domain. And he describes life more like a web than a tree. And this again shows you the inductive nature of science. The tree of life may have been taught as a fact in documentaries, in textbooks. You might have learnt it as a fact when you were at school. Some biologists may still call it a fact. But as you can see, some biologists disagree. So the geneticist Craig Venter, again, another atheist, another well-known authority, he also says life is maybe like a bush.
The reason that Venter said a bush instead of a tree is because the tree of life only applies to multicellular eukaryotes, while the vast majority of organisms are single-celled. And that's what he works with. So he reduced the significance of the tree to only cover the specific groups, which includes every animal there ever was. There are no biologists who dismiss the tree of life with regard to animals, and possibly another one for plants. I've argued myself that the tree of life is more the shape of a tumbleweed. But importantly, whether bush or weed or tree, it grows out of a web, because single-celled organisms are far more prone to horizontal gene transfer. Microbes can, on occasion, pass their genes to other organisms on contact by a few different means. This makes taxonomic classification at the microbial level very confused, because there isn't a single lineage, but very often several interconnected ones. Horizontal gene transfer happens in multicellular organisms too. 8% of the human genome came from viruses. But it's more difficult with multicellular organisms for obvious reasons. So the tree of life is still a verifiable fact of life.
In the early 20th century, there was a tooth that was found, and this tooth, from it, biologists thought that this is an early human ancestor. This is an ape man. And there was this picture drawn by an artist about this ape man. As you can see there, just from a tooth, they made this picture. He's there going out to club some, I don't know, zebras or something, and he's got someone next to him, perhaps his wife, nagging him so that he goes out to work. He seems to have domesticated some animals in the background. Now, this tooth, this was actually not something which one biologist who was working in his mom's basement came out, wrote a paper and said, here's a picture and here's a tooth. This was published in Science, which is the second most prestigious journal in the world after Nature. So if someone says, oh, if you really believe something to be absolutely true, then get it peer reviewed. Peer review is a beautiful process. It's a process that actually comes from the Islamic world, where the scientific method itself comes from. but it is not the absolute truth. Something being peer-reviewed means it's good science. It doesn't mean it's absolute, because nothing can be absolute in science.
So your original example that the Earth revolves around the sun was not absolute? Also, science talks about facts instead of truth, but they're not much different. Just as a fact is data that is confirmed correct, truth, as I understand it, is any statement that can be shown to be true, in which case there is no truth in any religion. But at no point would we say absolute truth, just like we don't say absolute fact. Can you show me the truth of it? Can you show me the facts? If you can, then we're done. There's no need to go to absolutes. But while we're speaking about truth, the truth is that the claim about the tooth being human wasn't published in the journal Science. It was published in a different journal without the picture. Now, that picture never appeared in any journal. That was the creation of a tabloid magazine, and even the man who found the tooth criticized them for their sensationalism. In the true spirit of peer review, not one of the scientists who reviewed that story about the tooth accepted his claim. They all demanded more evidence. And once he realized that it wasn't what he hoped it was, then a retraction to his original claim was published in the journal Science.
And this tooth, as some of you may know, was actually the tooth of a pig, which was mistakenly thought to be a human ancestor. Now, why did very intelligent biologists make up this huge story based upon this very little piece of evidence? And it's because of a fundamental assumption. And that fundamental assumption is that of naturalism. That every single thing that biologists study has naturalistic forces behind it, naturalistic factors behind it. We are forced by our a priori assumption, meaning before experience assumption, that, there has to be only materialism, only material causes. And that is actually a very interesting admission that they say materialism, naturalism, is absolute. So they can't accept that human beings or something else came in the history of the world without there being prior naturalistic causes.
Methodological naturalism is not an assumption. It's a requirement of the very definition of science as an examination of the physical, natural world. The purpose of science is to improve understanding, and the only way to do that is to seek out the flaws in your current perspective and correct them. But in order to do that, you have to separate fact from fantasy. You can't honestly claim to know something if you can't show that anything that you believe is even correct. And it doesn't matter what you believe. All that matters is why you believe it. So every postulation must be backed by evidence, and there has to be some way to prove whether it's wrong. The supernatural fails every category. So methodological naturalism is a necessary component, and it is the reason that science works. In fact, it is often referred to as the scientific method.
Fossils are very rare, and fossilization is very rare. And when you get this picture of, we have these nice fossils which show a transition between a ape-like creature to a human-like creature, and we split from the other primates about 7 million years ago. Fossils are very, very rare. So for someone to make the claim that we have fossils and this proves evolution, they've misunderstood how rare fossils actually are.
Maybe you don't understand how many fossils were found just in this one sequence alone, to say nothing of all of the other lineages that are now virtually complete, making an inarguable case. Despite the fact that fossilization is rare, they've still found the remains of thousands of individuals. And sure, there must have been millions, but we don't need to see them all, do we?
And this whole idea of a missing link, it's very popular. It's used by, even people who we sometimes consider to be mainstream scientists. But there's some big problems. If you imagine, you get these very famous YouTube clips where somebody's taking a picture of themselves every single day for like 20 years, 15 years. You see a nice, gradual change, and every single picture, if you imagine, is like a fossil. So you get a nice change over 10 years or 15 years, or in this case 2 years. And if you imagine those pictures that you have from which you make the video, if there's, 2-3 days missing, maybe a week missing, you may call that the missing link. But with the fossil record, we had the exact opposite. We firstly do not know, and we can't say with percentage how many organisms or how many species there actually are. So the philosopher of biology, John Wilkins, another atheist secularist, he says, there could be potentially millions of missing species that we don't even know about. There could be, an indefinite number of missing branches. What we have is random snapshots. Between the time of, say, something like the Lucy-like ancestor and a anatomically modern human, us, there is a couple of million years. You'd need millions of fossils to make a nice transition. Now, we're not expecting neo-Darwinists to have that because fossilization is very rare. It's like, you could say it's like lightning hitting an area. But what's important is, if you are going to make a story based upon very little evidence and assumptions, and which is speculative, no problem. There's nothing wrong with doing that, as long as you're open about the fact that there are assumptions and it is very speculative.
You still don't understand the science despite all your bragging. Science makes predictions that if this is true, then this is what we should find, or this is what an experiment result should be. But if this is not true, then we should expect some other result. And so they noticed that humans and apes were already so similar that apes were originally classified as humans. And if we evolved from them, we should find more ape-like people in the fossil record. And we did, lots of them. Ape-like, but still clearly people. So they said, well, we should find something halfway between the two. Something that is so nearly human that it is technically human, but still inarguably ape at the same time. Something that would certainly exist if evolution were true, but would only exist if evolution were true. And I explain this in a few of my videos. Australopithecus afarensis proved to be a fully bipedal ape whose hands, feet, teeth, pelvis, skull, and other physical details were exactly what creationists challenged us to find, yet they're still pretending we never found it. To prove that that happened, they didn't need every other link too, just that one.
You would think 99% was calculated in this way. Take out the chimp genome, human genome, 99% similarity, right? That's not what they did. They actually compared both of them. They saw 2.4 billion letters which are similar. They saw 1.3 billion letters which were different. They decided to ignore the 1.3 billion letters and only compare what was left over, and they calculated the 99%. Now you're going to think that's nuts. Why on earth did they do that? But that's actually, there's nothing wrong with doing that, because what they did is they assumed common ancestry between humans and chimps is true. So all of the differences in the DNA, the 1.3 billion letters, they said, let's ignore that.
No, they didn't. I couldn't figure out what you were referring to, so I asked a geneticist friend of mine, Concordance from the Magic Sandwich Show podcast. He found the reference right away and quoted from it, showing what the real issue was: the enormous technical challenges of comparing genomic sequences in a simple linear way when we're not talking about simple linear things. He said he didn't know what you were talking about with regard to leaving out shared sequences, and he says it's impossible to adequately explain this for laymen to understand, but he gave me a 5-point summary of your confusion. 1. There have been structural changes in the genome involving non-coding regions, gaps and insertions of repetitive DNA. 2. Those sequences don't always align, so they use repetitive DNA masking and gapped alignments when they compare genomes. 3. If you look at protein sequences, the part that is exposed to purifying selection/evolution, the sequences between chimp and human are 99% identical. 4. Scientists quibble about the 1% to 6% differences depending on whether you count the structural changes like chromosome fusions or increases in repetitive non-coding DNA, gene order shuffling in that number. But the basic relatedness is not in question. 5. All of this matters not to whether chimps are our closest cousins. No scientist disputes that. but whether our genetic differences can be explained by the 1% of differences that are in the coding regions or the 4% of total differences that represent the regions around the genes, the intergenic regions. The 1% comes from an examination of the protein coding DNA regions of the two genomes and only includes the heritable single nucleotide differences. It ignores the changes on the larger level, loss of whole genes, rearrangement of gene order, loss or gain of regions of chromosomes, and if you include those additional changes, the difference between chimp and human genomes climbs to 4%. And researchers think these large-scale changes may have played a bigger role in our evolution from common ancestor with chimpanzees. There is no question in the minds of anybody studying the comparative genomics of chimp and human that they are our closest cousins, not just because of the degree of homology and genetic similarity is high, but because of the specific signatures of selection.
We know there's no such thing as a missing link now. I hope we know that now.
Not anymore. Hasn't been missing for 40 years.
It's pretty much an ape.
Well, so are you. Humans are a subset of apes in exactly the same way that lions are a subset of cats and ducks are a subset of birds and iguanas are a subset of lizards. And they didn't just prove this morphologically, but also with genetics, and not just with the similarity either, but also with endogenous retroviruses that are shared between humans and apes and even some monkeys. ERVs of precisely the same type and location. And then there's all our dysfunctional monkey genes, genes that we and other primates share, but that work in them and are disabled in us. Then there's genes that are broken in all primates, which is the reason we can't synthesize vitamin C. That's why we get scurvy if we don't get enough citrus. So we are definitely apes and monkeys and eutherian mammals and bilateral deuterostome coelomates, just like you would expect of evolution, but which contradicts the alternative you would suggest.
Even Charles Darwin, he said, if there's no evidence for the Darwinian mechanism besides the classification of species, that's enough.
That is actually true. I mean, we have proof of evolution from many different fields, but this is the big one. I made a video about it. It's called the phylogeny challenge. It is the most powerful evidence of evolution and simultaneously the most damning evidence against creationism. Yes, yet it's the topic that most people don't know anything about. Throw away all your other arguments. None of them compare to this. If there was any truth to creation of separate kinds, or if there is any fundamental flaw in the overall theory of evolution from common ancestry, then it has to be here, or it simply can't be anywhere else.
So there is a big difference between evolution and Darwinism. Evolution, the biologist David wrote, the way he defines it is, is change in organisms over time. There's many different definitions, but there's evolution as a observation, or evolution as a fact, if you want to call it, and there is the mechanism, and maybe a history of evolution that comes with the Darwinian mechanism. So these two are two very different things. So just a brief recap of what is Darwinism. There are different models, but I'm going to go over the most popular model, which is, Luca, the last universal common ancestor. There's the first cell, and that cell slowly evolved, and you had different branches of this magnificent tree of life. And the driving force behind this evolution is variations which are being worked on by natural selection. You can call it mutations instead of variations, doesn't really make a difference. So that's basically it, and that accounts for all of the diversity of life as we know it.
Your definitions are very confused. I understand biological evolution to be a theory of biodiversity and an aspect of population genetics summarily defined as descent with inherent modification. If you call it Darwinism, then you're limiting your mechanisms to the ones Darwin proposed, natural and sexual selection. But evolution has moved on since Darwin, and we're not all that concerned with just the Darwinian mechanisms anymore. And you cite people who you think disagree with the Darwinian mechanism, natural selection, but you say you don't have a problem with it. You even called it an observation in the same talk where you said that it is not a fact. That's confusing. Yet your challenge seems to be whether the function itself is a fact, because you keep implying that about the Darwinian explanation of evolution, as if you accept evolution but think there's a better explanation for it. I know that is clearly not what you mean. You don't accept evolution at all, largely because you don't know what it is, and you don't know what the evidence for it is, and you don't know what we know about it. You don't even know that we know anything about it.
We don't know what we don't know. It's not that we don't know, something about something we know. It's the fact that we don't know something about what we don't know.
There is plenty about evolution that we actually do know, but if you apply your thinking to religious beliefs, then you'd be correct.
Bait and switch. So here's a very simple, two very simple pictures to understand bait and switch. Evolution is just a theory, like gravity. Okay. From what I've said now, you know evolution is an observation like gravity. There's nothing wrong with saying that. But gravity is an observation, and the theory to explain it is general relativity. Evolution is an observation, and the theory to explain it is the Darwinian mechanism, or the neo-Darwinian synthesis, whatever you want to call it. So these are two very different things. They have different epistemic weights. Of course they do. And you'll find something like this picture, sometimes deliberate, sometimes accidental, where someone might say, I see evolution happening in my lab. It's a fact. And he's talking about maybe something similar to Ketwell's, peppered moth example. And the child's thinking, oh, he sees, a small fish turning into a primate or something like that.
Well, we'd like to think that people are at least intelligent enough that they know that we didn't just say that we watched 500 million years pass by yesterday. But when you're dealing with creationists, you can't give them that much credit.
Bait and switch word games. You're going to hear this all the time. You want proof of evolution? You want proof that there's common ancestry between humans and apes? Well, look at Lenski's bacterial experiment. Look at the peppered moth examples of Ketwell. So you're going to get this bait and switch. They're speaking about something else, they're trying to prove something else, and they use language as a...
It's not proving something else, it's answering your question. You want proof that evolution is a fact? Look at the fact that evolution happens, that biodiversity and complexity do increase, that both occur naturally according to the laws of population genetics amid environmental dynamics. Look at the fact that alleles vary with increasing distinction in reproductive populations, and that these are accelerated in genetically isolated groups. Look at the fact that natural selection, sexual selection, and genetic drift have all been proven to have predictable effect in guiding this variance, both in the scientific literature and in practical application. Now look at the fact that significant beneficial mutations do occur and are inherited by descendant groups, and that several independent sets of biological markers do exist which trace these lineages backward over myriad generations. Look at the fact that birds are a subset of dinosaurs in the same way that ducks are a subset of birds, and of course that humans are apes in the same way that lions are cats, and so on. Now look at the fact that the collective genome of all animals has been traced to its most basal form through reverse sequencing, and that those forms are also indicated by comparative morphology, physiology, and embryological development, as well as through chronologically correct placement of successive stages revealed in the geologic column. Now look at the fact that every animal on Earth has obvious relatives either living nearby or evident in the fossil record, and that the fossil record holds hundreds of clearly transitional species, even according to the strictest definition of that term. Look at the fact that both microevolution and macroevolution have both been directly observed and documented dozens of times, both in the lab and in naturally controlled conditions in the field, and that these instances have all withstood critical analysis in peer review. And consider the fact that evolution is the only explanation of biodiversity with either evidentiary support or measurable validity, and that no would-be alternative notion has ever met even one of the criteria required of a scientific theory. Creationism, since you brought it up, is not in any sense a working model capable of explaining anything at all. It isn't supported by anything and has already been disproved on every testable claim that it makes. You're trying to ride a dead horse.
Any set of data can fit many different theories.
Perhaps, but in this case there is only one. Evolution is the only theory of biodiversity there is or ever was. And you got theory confused with hypothesis and tried to suggest a number of crackpot suggestions like the aquatic ape theory, or the idea that humans are a hybrid of apes and pigs. And you actually said that all of these qualify as scientific simply because they don't evoke the supernatural, meaning that they didn't happen by magic. But to be scientific, they have to be evident and testable, and they have failed. Now, I could make several videos explaining what you got wrong in this talk, but I want to get to the end here. So let me just touch a few other items. You mentioned penis bones, that apes have them and humans don't. That's not quite true. They're greatly reduced slivers to the point that they may be absent in many chimps, and they're an atavism which has shown up in some people. You also mentioned Ida, and I want to say that way back when that story came out, I made videos myself objecting to the sensationalism behind it, showing that she was a transitional between haplorhines and strepsirhines and not a human ancestor. There's nothing worse for science than sensationalism, which is what religion thrives on. And that's why you use words like absolute fact, and I don't need to. Now, I have friends who've read The Selfish Gene who say that you haven't. I haven't either, but I understand the concept. Because we are a societal species raised in dependence by caregivers, there is a strong selective pressure to produce altruists with compassion for their family, friends, and fellows. On a scale of population mechanics, insensitive sociopaths have a tendency to be weeded out of the gene pool, either by being killed or banished or imprisoned, while those who look out for others have the selective advantage. It just mathematically works out that what we do for others more often benefits our own lineage than for strangers. It's like saying that most accidents happen in the home. Well, of course they are. Where do you spend all your time? And there are many vestigial organs which are completely useless, and I can give a few specific examples of that, like the claw in the arm of the emu. Well, it's not a wing, it is an arm. It's like a little dinosaur-like arm. Well, it is a dinosaur arm because they're dinosaurs. But the point is that emus don't have muscle to move their arm, so they can't use that claw. So why do they have it? They have it because they were dinosaurs once upon a time. That's obvious. Now, but vestigial traits can also be adapted to new functions. Take penguin wings that are being adapted into flippers, for example. Or it can retain a diminished capacity of its original function, like our own canines. It is a vestige because it is a leftover trait that no longer serves the capacity that it used to. Now, moving on, panspermia is one of several viable hypotheses contributing to abiogenesis. It is not an alternative to evolution. And finally, you don't get to say that a lack of creator counts as a creator, or that the opposite of creation is creationism. Quit projecting your own faults onto those who will not share them.
So just to summarize, I started with the name of God. God has the picture. We as human beings have the pixel. We have the fragmentary knowledge.
You see, you just state that as fact, but it's not. That is not something you actually know. That is an empty assertion and thus beneath serious consideration.
Everything good that I've said is from God, the Creator, and every mistake has been my own.
Then God took no part in your presentation.